He delivered the news to the conference table rather than to her face, and that detail was what stayed with Talia afterward. Not the words themselves which she had been preparing for, but the fact that Adrian didn't look at her when he said them. 14 people were seated around the glass table in Row Architecture Group's 22nd floor boardroom. The Toronto skyline pressed up behind the windows, gray February light glass towers, the CN Tower standing half hidden in low cloud. Most of the people at the table were staring at their hands. A few were staring at nothing in particular. Her husband of 7 years, Adrian Rowe, sat at the head of the table with his arms folded, his expression arranged into something she imagined he thought looked measured and professional. Like she was a contractor with an expired agreement. Like she wasn't the woman who had stayed up with him at their kitchen table while he studied for his MBA, who had learned his professional weaknesses by heart and quietly shored them up, who had held his career together with both hands while he found his footing as the firm's new CEO. Your role as principal architect is being dissolved, effective immediately, Adrian said. It's a restructuring decision, nothing personal. 3 seats down from him, Helena Strauss, Senior Project Director 34, a notepad open in front of her she hadn't written a word on in 20 minutes, glanced sideways at her manicure. On what grounds? Talia asked. Her voice was steady. She had rehearsed this. Adrian slid a folder across the table. Budget overruns on the Harborview file, missed client deliverables, it's all documented. She didn't open the folder. She already knew what was inside. Inflated figures, misattributed timelines. Signatures from project managers who understood which direction Adrian's goodwill flowed and had made their decisions accordingly. She had seen early drafts of these same documents 6 weeks ago, and the experience had sent her to sit alone in the underground parking for 40 minutes, before she trusted herself to drive home. For the record, said Frank Oylaran, head of operations from across the table, this process has not followed standard HR protocol. Noted, Adrian said without looking at him. He turned back to Talia. Is there anything you'd like to say? She looked at her husband, this man whose career her father had nurtured from a junior draftsman to the firm's CEO. This man who had delivered Stuart Rowe's eulogy with such apparent sincerity that people had wept, who had stood at the reception afterward and shaken the hands of her father's old colleagues and accepted their condolences with exactly the right amount of gravity. This man who had been sleeping with Helena Strauss for at least 14 months. Who had been routing the firm's operating funds through a ghost consultancy in Calgary for nearly 2 years, who was so certain of his position in this room, that he still wasn't looking directly at her. She could have said any of it. She could have said all of it and watched his face rearrange itself in real time. But that wasn't the plan. Nothing, Talia said, except, I hope you've thought this through very carefully, Adrian, I really do. Something moved behind his eyes, just a flicker there and gone. Then Helena shifted in her seat and he looked away. You have 1 hour to clear your personal items, he said. Security will escort you out. Talia nodded once. She stood, picked up her leather portfolio and walked to the door without looking back. She had brought 1 box, deliberately small. Over the previous 5 weeks she had quietly removed everything that actually mattered from her office. The framed photograph of her parents at the firm's opening night, her father's old drafting compass with the brass hinge, the external hard drive with 7 years of project files backed up to her personal cloud account. What remained was mostly things she could do without. A spare umbrella, a mug with a chip in the rim, a box of peppermint tea she'd never gotten around to finishing. She put the mug in the box anyway. She wanted it to look like packing. Priscilla Yates appeared in the office doorway before Talia had finished. Priscilla was head of sustainable design and the person Talia trusted most in the building. Her arms were crossed and her voice was kept very low. This is wrong, Priscilla said. Every person on this floor knows it's wrong. I know. What are you going to do? Talia picked up the box. Go home. Priscilla studied her face with the expression she'd worn in the hallway before the meeting, reading for something running just beneath the surface. You're not scared. I'm fine, Talia said. Don't say anything right now. Just trust me. The security escort was a young man named Marco, who had once helped Talia carry presentation boards from the loading dock through a rainstorm the previous spring. He didn't speak in the elevator. In the lobby he held the door open and said quietly, I'm sorry, Ms. Rowe. Thank you, Marco, she said. Take care of yourself. She walked through the revolving door and out onto Bay Street into the cold. She sat in her car for 3 minutes without moving, then she called Bernard Crane. It happened, she said when he picked up. He did it. Boardroom, 14 witnesses, 1 hour to clear out. Then the trust activates. Bernard had been her father's solicitor for 22 years, and had managed the estate in the difficult months after Stuart Rowe's death. His voice carried the particular steadiness of a man who had been expecting this call for some time. "I'll file the ownership transfer papers with the board tonight. They'll have notification before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. And the rest." "Carmen has been in contact with the RCMP Commercial Crimes Unit for 3 weeks. They're ready to move, and your divorce papers are prepared. Say the word." Talia exhaled slowly. 7 months. 7 months of carrying all of this inside while she smiled at Adrian across dinner tables and attended client presentations beside him and pretended that the ground beneath their life together was still solid. "Give the word," she said. 7 months earlier she had come home early from a project review in Montreal. Adrian's laptop was open on the kitchen island, still logged in. He was upstairs in the shower. She walked past it. Then something, some peripheral wrongness she couldn't have named if someone had asked her, made her stop and go back. The inbox was open. There was a thread at the top she had never seen. She read the first 2 lines. Then she read them again. She stood very still in her own kitchen and understood, with a clarity that was almost frightening in how composed it felt, that the architecture of her life had a structural failure she had not been looking for. The thread went back 14 months. It was detailed and unambiguous. Helena Strauss's name was on every message. She didn't cry. She would wonder about that later, whether she should have, whether the absence of tears in that moment said something unflattering about her. Instead she took photographs of every message she could access, forwarded them to her personal account, closed the laptop, poured herself a glass of water, and was standing at the kitchen window looking out at the backyard when Adrian came downstairs. "You're back early," he said, and kissed her cheek. "Flight was ahead of schedule," she said. She made dinner. She listened to him talk about a commercial project in Vaughan. She laughed at something he said. She was so convincing that she frightened herself a little. That night, after he fell asleep, she went to her father's old study at the end of the hall and started pulling threads. By 2 in the morning, she had found the Calgary Consultancy, a numbered company incorporated 18 months ago, receiving regular payments from Rowe Architecture Group's operating account on a billing cycle that never varied. The invoices were for project management consulting. There were no deliverables on record, no physical address beyond a mail forwarding service, no named contacts. The money flowed into an account Adrian had opened alone, at a credit union in Oakville, 4 months before the first invoice had appeared. She traced nearly $1.4 million before she forced herself to stop and breathe. At 6 in the morning she called Bernard Crane. "Tell me about my father's estate," she said, sitting across from him in his Adelaide Street office. She had not slept. She was still in the clothes she'd had on the day before. The actual structure, not the version that was presented at probate. Bernard looked at her with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific conversation for a long time, and has known, with some certainty, that it would eventually arrive. "Your father loved Adrian in the early years," he said. "He was genuinely glad you were happy, but by the end, the last 2 years before he died, he had started to see things that troubled him. He didn't say it directly. Stuart was not a man who said difficult things out loud when he could act on them instead. What her father had done was this. In the final year of his life he had restructured his estate, placing 60% of Rowe Architecture Group into a private trust with Talia as sole beneficiary. The documents reviewed at probate had indicated a 50-50 split between Talia and Adrian. The trust was a separate instrument, registered, legal and invisible to anyone who had not been specifically told to look for it. The trigger condition was simple. The trust would activate if Talia were ever removed from the firm, or if documented misconduct by any other principal were established. "He never told me," Talia said. "He didn't want to put doubt in your marriage. He just wanted to know you'd be protected if the doubt turned out to be warranted." She sat with that. Her father had seen something she hadn't been ready to look at squarely, and instead of naming it, he had quietly built her a shield and said nothing, and trusted her to be standing when the time came. "What do I need to do?" she asked. "Document everything," Bernard said, "then wait for him to move. The moment he does, the trust is yours." She hired Carmen Varga, who had spent 11 years with the RCMP Commercial Crime Unit before going private. Carmen was thorough in the particular way of someone who has spent over a decade prosecuting financial fraud and has lost all patience for sloppy work. Within 3 weeks she had traced the complete structure of the Calgary scheme: 2 shell companies, a nominee director in Red Deer who cooperated freely once the scope became clear, and a wire transfer pattern that Carmen described to Talia as not even slightly subtle. She had also, because Talia had asked, documented the affair with the same methodical care. Hotel receipts, calendar cross-references, a long sequence of firm-server communications that Helena had apparently sent without any thought that someone might eventually go looking. They weren't careful, Carmen said, sliding her summary across the table. They felt completely safe. People usually do, Talia said, until something changes. For 7 months she maintained both versions of her life. At the firm she ran design reviews, led client meetings, attended the October dinner where Adrian made a speech about craft and institutional integrity that she sat through without her expression changing. She came home and asked about his day. She made plans for Christmas. She sat across from him at breakfast and showed him nothing. Priscilla was the only other person who knew. Priscilla had held her while she cried on the nights when the weight of it became too much to carry alone, had talked her down from the moments when what she wanted most in the world was to stand up in a Monday morning briefing and lay every piece of evidence on the table. If you move too early, Priscilla told her once, past midnight on a Tuesday, he'll destroy everything he can reach and spin the rest. You know how he operates. You've watched him do it to other people in that building. Talia had known she was right. So she had waited. She had waited for Adrian to feel completely safe, for the plan he was executing to feel nearly finished, for the last remaining obstacle, her, to seem like something that could be resolved cleanly with a boardroom meeting and a prepared folder. She had waited for him to make the move she had understood, since the night she stood at the kitchen island, reading 14 months of messages, that he would eventually make. On a Wednesday morning in February he had made it. She was at the building's main entrance by 8:15 the following morning, wearing the charcoal suit her father had bought her the day she made partner. She had not worn it since his funeral. She had slept 4 hours and felt, despite everything, completely clear. The security officer at the front desk looked up when she came through the doors. "Miss Rowe," he said, "your access card, I'm not sure I can." "Check the board notification that came in before 9 last night," she said pleasantly. "Take your time." He looked at his screen, his expression changed. "Of course," he said. "I'm sorry, Miss Rowe, go right up." She took the elevator to the 22nd floor. Bernard was already in the corner boardroom with the firm's 5 external board members, each of whom had received an emergency shareholder notice before midnight. She went in and sat down at the head of the table, the same chair where Adrian had sat the previous morning, when he'd handed her the falsified folder and told her she had 1 hour. 4 minutes later, she watched Adrian step off the elevator. He walked the way he always walked, quickly, head up, already on his phone, radiating the confidence of someone who has not yet encountered the morning. Then he looked at the boardroom. He registered the board members. He registered Bernard standing. He registered Talia at the head of the table, and his pace slowed to nothing. She watched him run the calculation. She watched him decide there was an explanation for this, that whatever was unfolding could still be managed. He straightened his shoulders and came to the door. "What is this?" he said. "I didn't call a board meeting." "I did," Talia said. "Sit down, Adrian." "You don't have the authority." "As of 9:47 last night she holds 60% of this firm," Bernard said. "When you terminated her employment without cause yesterday morning, the trust instrument your father-in-law established activated in full. Shall I walk you through the documentation, or would you prefer your solicitor reviews it first?" The color left Adrian's face in stage. Bernard walked the board through the trust instrument. Carmen's investigative summary covered the Calgary scheme in detail, the shell companies, the nominee director, the transfer pattern, the Oakville account. A third solicitor Talia had retained presented the legal analysis of the HR violations. Adrian sat through 22 minutes of documentation without speaking. He looked, by the end of it, like a man who had walked through a wall he had been certain wasn't there. Talia called for the vote. All 5 board members voted to remove him as CEO. It took less than 3 minutes. "You'll surrender your firm credentials and all company devices by end of day," Talia said. She kept her voice level because this was not the moment for anything else. There would be time later for whatever she was going to feel about all of it. "Security will escort you from the building. You have 1 hour." Adrian looked at her across the table. "When I walked out yesterday," he said very quietly, "you already knew." "I've known for 7 months," she said. "Since the night you left your email open on the kitchen island and went upstairs." Something passed across his face that she had not anticipated, not calculation. Something closer to genuine grief, which arrived too late to matter, and which she therefore felt nothing about. Helena was waiting in the hallway outside the boardroom. Whatever Adrian said when he reached her made her step back. He moved past her and went to his office alone and closed the door. 53 minutes later, security walked him to the elevator with a box of personal items. He didn't look at anyone. He had run this firm, by preference, by fear, by the accumulated weight of 3 years as its public face, and now he was being walked out in front of the people whose careers he had shaped and in some cases ended. No one in the open plan office spoke as he passed. Talia stood at the window of what was now her office and watched his car leave the parking structure. Then she took out her phone. "It's done," she typed to Priscilla. 3 seconds later, "Tell me everything." "Come up," she typed back, "I'll put the kettle on." The RCMP investigation moved quickly. The Calgary scheme was fully traced within 10 days. Both shell companies, the nominee director, the complete transfer history. Adrian's Oakville account was frozen. He was charged with fraud and breach of fiduciary duty 7 weeks after his removal from the firm. Helena, who had been directly involved in creating the false billing invoices, was charged as an accessory. She resigned the following morning and retained her own counsel. An HR investigation that ran over the next month surfaced complaints from 4 other employees regarding her conduct during Adrian's tenure. She told investigators she had not understood the full scope of what she was facilitating. The investigation's written report did not use the word credible. The divorce moved cleanly, in the way divorces move cleanly when one party has committed fraud against the other, and the other has a thorough solicitor and a fully documented case. The prenuptial agreement Adrian had signed 7 years ago, without much thought, held without challenge. He received his personal possessions and a settlement. He received nothing from the firm, nothing from Talia's family assets, nothing from the house. They met once in the solicitor's offices to sign the final papers. Adrian looked like someone who had not been sleeping well for some time. "I did love you," he said, just before he stood to leave. "I know that doesn't change anything, but it was real." "I believe you," she said, because some part of her did, "but love by itself isn't enough to build on. You understand that now." She did not watch him go. The firm had suffered, and she did not try to frame it otherwise to the people who worked there. 3 major clients had paused their engagements. 2 senior staff had resigned. The press coverage, accurate and not particularly gentle, had run for 2 weeks in the trade publications and been picked up by 2 national papers. Talia had been photographed on the front steps of the building, looking composed, which she was mostly, and which she had worked at. She promoted Frank Oyleran to Chief Operating Officer. She brought in an external auditor and rebuilt the financial oversight structure from the beginning. She met personally with every client who had suspended their project, walked them through exactly what had happened and what had changed, and asked directly for the chance to earn back their trust. 3 returned within 2 months. 1 did not come back, and she told Frank that she understood why and they would not push, and she meant it. The staff meeting she held in the building's atrium in the 2nd week after the board vote was the most important 40 minutes of her tenure as CEO. 81 people, every level. Junior designers barely 2 years out of school. Project managers who had worked alongside her father. Everyone in between, standing or sitting on the stairs that curved up through the atrium's 3 floors. She told them what had happened. She told them what had been found and what was being done about it. She told them what she intended to build. She told them that her father had started Row Architecture Group on the conviction that design was not just a profession but a form of service. That the places where people lived and worked and came together shaped their lives in ways both visible and invisible, and that the firm's job was to take that seriously at every decision point. She told them that conviction had been gradually hollowed out, and that her job now was to find it and build it back. She meant every word. That was the part, she thought afterward, that the staff could feel. That she was not performing sincerity. She was simply telling the truth. Frank told her that evening it was the first time in 2 years he'd seen the junior staff look like they intended to stay. Over the following months, the firm changed. People who had spent years being careful about what they said in meetings started saying it. The suggestions box that had stood empty under Adrian's leadership required emptying twice a week. The open plan floor was louder, more contested, more genuinely collaborative than it had been in years. Some of that was the cultural work Talia and Frank drove deliberately. Some of it happened on its own once the pressure was off. She reached out personally to every employee who had been the subject of Adrian or Helena's harassment. She met with each of them, acknowledged what had happened, and offered what the firm could offer. She could not undo the past 2 years. She could make sure the next 20 years were different, and she could begin that work immediately, and she did. She met Ronan Alves 4 months after she took over as CEO. When the city of Toronto brought him in as an urban planning consultant to review the firm's mixed-use development proposal near the Portlands, he arrived for their first meeting with specific and well-considered questions about stormwater capacity, green space allocation, and community access points. He had clearly read the full submission. She liked him immediately, which surprised her, because she had not been expecting to like anyone new for some time yet. He was thoughtful and unhurried. He had a 7-year-old daughter named Bia, from a co-parenting arrangement he described, without bitterness or performance, as something that had taken 2 years to get right and now mostly worked. He and Bia's mother had been better as friends than as partners, he said, and had eventually admitted that to each other, which had been difficult and had also been the right thing. Talia appreciated that he said it directly. She was finding in the months after Adrian's removal that she had very little patience left for indirectness. Bia visited the office once on a day Ronan stopped by to review revised drawings and spent 20 minutes studying the physical model of the Portland's proposal before declaring it almost as good as a Lego set. Talia decided this was a genuine compliment. Bia also discovered the box of drafting pencils in the supply cupboard and asked with the specific gravity of a 7-year-old who has given a matter serious consideration, whether she could keep one. Talia gave her 2. They took things slowly. Talia had spent 7 months waiting carefully for one thing. She was willing to wait again for another. Ronan seemed to understand this without needing it explained. "You don't have to earn this," he told her one evening, when she apologized for needing more time than she felt a reasonable person ought to need. "We just go at whatever pace is right. There's no deadline." Adrian entered his guilty plea in November. His lawyer had negotiated through the summer, but the documentary evidence had left him limited options. He received 18 months at a federal facility, 3 years of supervised release, full restitution of $1.4 million plus interest and penalties, and permanent revocation of his professional licenses. At the sentencing hearing, Talia gave a victim impact statement. She had written it longhand at her father's old desk on 3 separate evenings, throwing out the first 2 versions before the third one felt honest enough to keep. She talked about her father. She talked about what it meant to inherit a firm. Not just the assets and the client relationships and the Bay Street address, but the values that had built them, the philosophy her father had carried with him, from a rented studio in the annex 30 years ago to a 22-floor office that bore his name. She talked about what it felt like to discover that someone had been methodically dismantling that inheritance for his own gain, from the inside, while using her father's own name to do it. She talked about the employees who had left because they couldn't endure the culture Adrian had built. She talked about the clients who had taken their business elsewhere. She talked about the junior staff who had told her, in the months since, that they had spent 2 years afraid to disagree with anyone in a meeting. She did not ask the court for a specific sentence. She asked for accountability. She said that what had been done, the financial crimes, the abuse of position, the systematic damage to people who had placed their trust in a leader, carried consequences, and that she was asking the court to make those consequences real. Adrian spoke briefly. He apologized to the employees. He apologized to the clients. He looked at Talia when he said he was sorry to her, directly, and she held his gaze and let him finish and said nothing, because there was nothing left that needed to be said. Outside the courthouse it was snowing, the dry, fine snow of a Toronto December that settles on wool and doesn't melt. Priscilla stood beside her, their shoulders touching, neither of them speaking for a while. "How are you doing?" Priscilla asked finally. "I genuinely don't know yet," Talia said. "Ask me next week." She visited her father's grave on a Saturday in January, when the ground was frozen and the sky above the cemetery was the particular high cold blue that only happens in an Ontario winter. She brought yellow tulips, which was what her father had always kept in a jar on his drafting table. She sat on the bench beside the headstone and talked to him the way she had been talking to him since he died, partly out loud, partly somewhere interior. She told him the firm had finished its strongest quarter since the restructuring. She told him about the Portlands project, city approved, sustainability certified, Row Architecture Group's name on the planning application alongside a designation her father had spent years wanting to pursue and never quite had the bandwidth for. She told him about Frank, who had turned out to be a better operations chief than anyone had recognized while Adrian was in the way. She told him about the suggestions box, and about the junior designer who had submitted a proposal for a new community use clause in all their residential contracts, which Talia had read 3 times and then approved and built into the firm's standard agreements. She told him about Ronan. She told him about Bia, who had been to the office twice more since the first visit, and who had very strong opinions about drafting pencils and architectural models, and the correct way to eat a chocolate chip muffin, which apparently involved eating around the outside first. She sat with the quiet for a while. The cold settled around her shoulders. Somewhere nearby a crow called once and stopped. "You knew before I did," she said to the stone. "And you built something to protect me before I even understood I might need it." She placed one hand flat on the cold granite for a moment. Then she stood, straightened her coat, and walked back to her car. The firm's 25th anniversary dinner was held the following autumn at a design center on King Street West, the building where her father had taken his firm when it finally outgrew its first office. Every person who worked there was invited. So were the clients and contractors and city planners who had worked alongside them for 10 and 15 and 20 years. So was Bernard Crane, who arrived with his wife and shook Talia's hand and told her, for at least the fourth time that year, that Stuart would have been proud of her. She believed him more each time. At the lectern, she talked about her father and about what he had built and what it stood for. She announced a new apprenticeship program for architecture students from underrepresented communities, funded by the firm in partnership with 2 foundations. She announced an Edmonton office and a new collaboration with 3 Indigenous-led design studios on a cultural center project in the Northwest Territories, the kind of work her father had always said he wanted to pursue when the firm was big enough to take it on properly. It was big enough now. The applause was warm and long and felt like the real thing. Afterward, walking to her car through the lit streets, she scrolled briefly past a reference to Adrian in a news aggregator, something about parole conditions, her name not mentioned. She put her phone away and kept walking. She thought about the morning she had walked out of the building on Bay Street, with her small, mostly empty box, and sat in the cold of the parking structure, and made a phone call that changed the shape of everything. She had been afraid of losing her marriage, her home, her sense of the life she had been building. She had lost 2 of those 3. What she had found in their place was something her father had apparently believed about her before she could see it in herself, that she had what it took to hold very still in the dark, and wait for the moment that was hers, and then to move. Adrian had tried to reduce her to a line item in a restructuring decision. Instead, he had walked her directly to the ownership, the proof, and the clarity. She hadn't needed to destroy him. He had done that entirely on his own, in the same boardroom where he had sat so certain of his victory and asked her if she had anything to say. She'd had nothing to say, then. She had her whole life to say it now, and she intended to take her time.